I'm Wendelin Reich. I'm the CEO of Virtual Beings, a small startup based out of France. As the name suggests, we focus on game AI. We develop currently a game which is scheduled to release later this year. We also develop our custom technology, but we do not commercialize it as middleware. And I mention that because it means that I, standing here, actually do not have a vested interest in convincing you that virtual reality needs better game AI. But you don't have to believe me. We can start with a quote from someone who is much more well-known than me, who was actually mentioned once before today. Kim Library is the CTO of Epic Games, well-known for the Unreal Engine. And he said in an interview last year, the next frontier for virtual reality is artificial intelligence. And he went on to talk a bit about the potential. What he didn't do, unfortunately for us, is that he never explains why he believes that AI is the next frontier for VR. So we're going to explore that together today. And let's start exploring that by asking ourselves, what is great game AI anyway? The problem with that question is that it's a bit like asking, what's a great smartphone in 2004? Or what's great computer graphics in 1985, right? It's very obvious that we're not there yet. So let's instead ask, what would be great game AI? And here, the scientist in me, been in academia for many years before I started game development, the scientist seeks a general answer, and the simplest answer I can come up with is that great game AI coheres with players' cognitive expectations, right? You, I, everybody, we have this innate knowledge of what makes people behave, how animals behave, what constitutes normal talk. And we use that knowledge all the time when we encounter virtual characters. And as soon as those characters start walking into walls or talking, like saying the same things over and over again, our expectations break. They do not break necessarily when the behavior is unrealistic, as you know if you have ever watched a Disney movie, right? Now, the problem is that knowing from a scientific point of view what are those cognitive expectations we have when we encounter AI is hard. Fortunately, it's not hard to just use them as a normal human being, right? Part of your biological makeup to know great AI when you see it. And so we can rely on that intuitive skill of every normal person. And I want to illustrate that with two examples of what I think is flawless game AI. They might surprise you a bit. First, if you remember the incompetent security bots from the original BioShock, right? Just fly around, come at you once in a while, shoot at you. But the great thing about them is that they are really bad at flying, right? They bump into walls and stuff, end up doing more harm than good. And they do a really good performance when they are incompetent flying about. So they never overpromise, and what they do is entirely in line with what you expect them to do. They work. Second, you all have played Journey. You remember the helpful papery beings flying around in the world of Journey. Most of the time, they just mind their own business, but you can summon them once in a while, and then they'll help you. And afterwards, they go around minding their own business, flying around in the landscape, a bit like fish in an aquarium. And while they do that, they are perfect. They never do anything which violates your expectations toward them. And so they are what I would consider an example of great game AI. Let's look at some examples from recent virtual reality games. And keeping in mind that, of course, there's just so very little AI content out there now. But I think there are a few illustrative cases among the best examples. First, Gary the Gull, the demo of a few minutes on the Vive where you encounter a gull flying towards you, stopping in front of you, starts to talk, He basically tries to convince you to look backwards so he can steal your food, which is right in front of you. For the 2-3 minutes that lasts, it works, I think. Second, everybody's favorite, recently came out, Resident Evil 7, gives you a, let's say, normal horror AI experience, but transferred to virtual reality, with very short interactions, of course. Third, a few months ago, there was a very interesting demo coming out on the Vive called Gnomes and Goblins, where you are in the middle of a magic forest. You are some kind of, probably a giant from the perspective of the goblins that live in the trees around you. Those goblins, they're very cautious, but also very curious. And so they start hiding from you in the beginning, but then they're curious, they explore you a bit, and in the end, you get to give them an apple. You have a short but very sweet interaction with them. Thirdly, Summer Lesson, title for the PlayStation VR, came out last year, which has you playing in the role of a summer teacher who gives English lessons to over-sexualized 16-year-old teenagers. Very weird Japanese kind of experience, which probably will never come out here in the West. Finally, Fantastic Beasts VR on Daydream, which has you interact briefly with beasts from the Harry Potter universe. Now, I think all of these examples work in their own way. But there's a catch. They're all based on the same trick, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the book of game AI. It's called dominating the initiative. Right? You put the player in a position where they never can take over. They're always passive or semi-passive. Everything that happens is dictated by the game setting and by the AI, right? And that's why these examples are all very low tech. In fact, one of them, and I mentioned that very specifically as an example of AI that works, Fantastic Beasts, is not even procedural. It's all pre-rendered, but you don't know that, right? So this trick works in some scenarios. It works for the demos mentioned, or for the games mentioned, when your characters are extremely interesting and the interaction is brief. It also works occasionally in the real world, and I only mention that as a side note, when you actually want to dominate the initiative, right? Invade Crimea and force your adversary to either start World War III or do nothing, right? But let's not talk too much about politics. If you agree with me so far, then you will realize that the examples we have of AI that works in VR games and demos doesn't really generalize. There's obviously a lot of games which you can't make if you always are going to dominate the initiative. But do we need great game AI for VR? Do we need it to be even greater than whatever you have or whatever we will have on desktop platforms in the future? Actually, I don't even have to convince you that we do, if you are among the people who believe that VR drives towards realism, as a lot of people do. Because part of that realism will obviously be that your AI characters behave like actual people or actual animals. However, you do not have to make this assumption. I don't. But even then, I want to convince you that VR needs great game AI. And let's start with a negative reason. Bad AI is simply much more visible in virtual reality for several reasons. First of all, immersion, created through the feeling of presence itself. Immersion is really just another way of saying that your cognitive expectations are much higher. And they become much more fragile. And we already know that because they can break because of bad head tracking, bad graphics, bad sound. Of course, they can also break if your NPCs behave stupidly. Second, the lack of player movement, to the extent, of course, that VR games have little or no play movement. It just means that the character is less busy consuming space. And you, the player, often consume space in AI-driven games on desktop. Many first-person shooters are based on that assumption. You don't rush through settings anymore. You're going to spend more time looking at the same NPCs, which correspondingly have to be better. Then, proximity, and therefore inspectability of the assets. If you take what's projected usually on a desktop screen and project it on the entire field of view of the player, everything is just much more visible, including bad AI. And finally, and that one may be controversial, but I think it's at least true for a lot of games, the slower time scale. To the extent that immersion works and that you transport your player to a place where they really want to be, you slow down their interaction with the game, right? They do not feel as much that they have to burn through content to be entertained, which means they are going to spend more time with your content. Now, a second reason is ultimately a positive one. And it's the fact that great AI opens up artistic possibilities, and the lack of great AI is artistically limiting. We'll talk about that in a second. Here I want to mention a third reason, which is very dear to me for personal reasons, and that is the fact that AI will be necessary to seduce a so far ignored demographic to virtual reality. And you ask yourselves, what target demographic could that be? Only half of the world's population. And now, I hope you are surprised. Why do women want AI-driven games, right? It turns out there's a lot of interesting research. And here I want to mention one study by two guys called Tyler Hartman and Christoph Klimt, and a paper they wrote on gender and computer games exploring females' dislikes. This paper was very clever because it did a quantitative and qualitative study asking what is it specifically that keeps women from liking certain games. And the strong answer they came up with is that there is a main dislike for women, and that is the lack of rich and sophisticated social interactions with virtual characters. With virtual characters, we're talking about single-player games here. This reason turned out to be more important than reasons we talk about more stereotypically, including negative gender roles and violence. These matter too, right? But lack of rich and sophisticated social interactions with virtual characters was number one. I want to mention a second line of research because this is something that I expect you to be a bit surprised by. A different way of looking at it is what does this demographic, women who, or basically anyone who wants to interact with virtual characters in a rich way, what kinds of games do they play at the moment? What games are in this niche? And there's a very interesting study coming out from the University of Turku, which classifies adults who play at least an hour a week into 7 player types. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to mention one of them. One of the larger ones was called the companion. It represented, in a representative study carried out in Finland and Denmark, 14% of the population. It was 81% female of all ages. And interestingly, players in this group played different games, but they predominantly played games from a single franchise. And that should really not surprise you. The Sims. So that's the gold standard right now if you want to have rich and sophisticated social interactions. And although I think it's a great game, I do think you can improve on the social interactions in a game which represents these interactions by way of emojis, right? And which puts you in this dollhouse perspective. There's a lot of more things you could do beyond The Sims. And that just means that for virtual reality, where the Sims franchise is not even yet available, this niche is, at the moment, a blue ocean. Now, I want you to imagine, just for a second, or maybe later today, a little bit more than a second, what kind of games you could do to satisfy this niche if technology were not an issue. What if AI tech was not the obstacle? Just imagine for a second. And I mean that literally, because I'm not going to give you any answers here. I'm just going to tell you what we at Virtual Beings have come up with as an answer. Our focus is 100% on virtual pet games. Because right now, the gold standard for virtual pet games is Nintendogs, which is a game that has come out more than 10 years ago, features very little AI. And if anyone among you has ever had a dog or a cat, you know that animals are complicated, right? And they are very interactive. And it's exactly these interactions that make them fun. And that's what we are trying to reproduce, right? For instance, by putting a lot of effort into making gaze, interactive gaze, believable, although it's procedural, right? The dog has a million ways of looking at you. We want to convey some of that richness. Now, enough of that. How do you create better AI for virtual reality? Well, simple. You only have to solve 3 tiny problems. Let's discuss them in the order of difficulty, although they are all difficult. First of all, there's the vision problem. Just exactly what are you trying to build? Like what kind of interaction do you want your players to have with a virtual character? And hopefully this interaction will last more than the 2 to 10 seconds it takes to shoot the AI, right? And how are you going to make money off of that? Difficult problem. Even more difficult is the UX problem, the user experience problem. You have an convincing AI. How do you use the metaphors of your game controls in order to allow the user to interact with this AI? Now, fortunately, this is a point where VR turns out to be much more promising than desktop, because on several platforms you now have hand controllers, right? For us, for instance, at Virtual Beings, it means that there's a natural metaphor for petting your dog with a touch controller. You don't need anything else for that. And finally, obviously, the tech problem, which is unfortunately so complicated that it's not even meaningful to touch upon it here. So, in closing, can I give you a few suggestions how to tackle these problems? Yes, I can. I want to give you 7 suggestions, and they all sound kind of obvious, yet they all tend to be violated almost all of the time. First one, treat AI as high risk, high reward. And that's not how game AI is done at the moment. At the moment, game AI is almost always an afterthought. Rarely a key part of a game's main value proposition, which means that product managers do not expect it to deliver high reward, and they do not want it to be high risk, which explains something which people in game AI like me find weird to observe for almost 10 years now, that you have very little progression of the quality of game AI since 2006-ish, since games like Fear 2. It's stagnant. So treat AI as high risk, high reward. Second, AI if you want it to be high-end, it must be driven by senior management. Right? It cannot be delivered to or led to people who do not carry the responsibility for the overall vision. And again, that's not how AI is handled usually these days. Third, develop a vision and strategy for engaging players via AI and via the user experience. Do not just think about AI in terms of something that you want to be autonomous and clever. Cleverness actually has nothing to do with it. And I and many people in the field think that the I part of artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer, right? My dog is usually not very smart, but it's still very, very complicated to reproduce. Intelligence has nothing to do with it. It's believability. How do you want to engage the user? How do you want them to interact with a believable creature? Know your target audience. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, right? There are target audiences out there which may want better AI, and you've never thought about them. Don't bet big, bet long term. Take a small team of very smart people, empower them, and give them time to come up with something new. Invest in R&D. Well, that's obvious, but what's not obvious is that R&D for AI is not just technology. It's also social psychology. It's also cognitive science. It's also design. It's user experience research. And finally, dream. Virtual reality fascinates all of us. Yet it's kind of interesting to note that there has not been a single dedicated television series on VR, ever. There might be one coming up soon. But there have been several already, for years now, on AI. AI is a topic which fascinates people, which makes them dream. Think Westworld. What could you do to people, to players, if you had great AI? Just dream. Thank you so much.
I find it very inspiring, and actually I believe it to be a very important question in order to provide content which makes a difference. But there are expressions like suspension of disbelief in virtual reality. There is the uncanny valley, so there is the uncanny valley curve regarding the visual appearance. Most probably there will be something like the uncanny valley curve regarding behavior, so probability of natural behavior. And there is something like the visual Turing test. So these are all things that these are all expressions, notions that I'm thinking of when I hear very naturalistic movement, very naturalistic appearance and behavior in virtual reality. But do we actually need that? Or is there something, do we really need natural mimic of natural movement? Or is it okay if virtual reality just has this suspension of disbelief, even with content which looks a little bit unrealistic, because it is virtual reality, because it does something which has nothing to do with natural environment?
The term suspension of disbelief is something which is used a lot and which I think is a little bit misleading in this context, because your brain never suspends any beliefs, right? That's not how it works. If you put your brain in a situation where none of its expectations are violated, it doesn't have to suspend anything. It's just going to believe all by itself. The tricky thing is to find out what are those expectations. They are often not what you think they are. So I agree with you that realism should not be the target. It can't be, because we can't deliver realistic AI yet. It's as simple as that. Nobody can. And motion capture and machine learning and a lot of other things which people are putting their hopes into probably will just contribute to raising expectations and disappointing people even more. Instead, I suggest to look at examples that already work. I mentioned Journey, right? The papery beings. Why do they work? Why do they never disappoint you? because they manage your expectation. They set them up in the right way. And another source of inspiration, I think, is animated movies, right? Which has, since its early days, been able to create experiences which are very far from reality, which even violate basic laws of physics, but which cohere with your expectations. And you can learn from those people, like the classic Disney animators in The Illusion of Life, for instance, what those expectations are. It has to do with, for instance, with anticipation, with rhythm, with timing. And if you get these things right, and if you put them on very simple characters that do not look like they promise too much, then I think you can go very far even today. All right, thank you so much.